Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes when nothing happens, but the quiet that settles just before history shifts. These stories are not about loud victories or battles, but about the soft turning of time, the unseen rituals that came before endings we could not yet see. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so that these forgotten histories can drift a little farther, maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. The 20th century began with a silence unlike any before it. Not the silence of peace, nor the silence of exhaustion after war, but something stranger. A silence heavy with expectation. Across the world, ordinary lives carried on in their familiar rhythms. Factories exhaled smoke into the skies. Families gathered around radios, listening to voices that drifted in from far-off places. Children played in courtyards and fields, unaware that deep within hidden laboratories, something was stirring that would change everything. It was there, among chalkboards covered in equations and instruments glowing faintly in the dark, that humanity touched the smallest building blocks of existence. Atoms, imagined once by ancient philosophers as invisible seeds of matter, were no longer just an idea. They could be measured, tracked, even broken apart. And when that nucleus split, it was as if a hidden sun had been uncovered. Light poured out in blinding brilliance, heat too fierce to measure, energy vast enough to reshape not just cities, but the course of the entire century. At first, the discovery was shared in whispers, papers passed between scientists, quiet discussions in lecture halls. There was wonder, but also unease. The power bound within the atom was not a flame that could be controlled with coal or wood. It was something deeper, stranger, unyielding. Yet in that silence, a dream began to take shape. Perhaps this fire could be used not for destruction, but for creation. Perhaps it could bring light without smoke, energy without hunger, abundance without war. But history is rarely patient. The 1940s arrived with marching boots, with the rumble of artillery, with the urgent pull of survival. Nations seized the atom not as a gift, but as a weapon. From deserts rose new suns that cast shadows sharper than anything before. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became names carved forever into human memory, cities where light meant loss, where silence fell heavier than words could carry. When the war ended, that silence remained. Leaders looked into the ruins, then into the laboratories, and imagined not just what had been destroyed, but what might yet be built. Concrete towers began to rise. Reactors were sealed within steel domes. Control rooms filled with blinking lights and murmuring gauges. The atom was being reborn, not as a bomb, but as a promise. A new kind of fire to drive engines, to power homes, to carry us into the future. Yet those who worked closest to it knew its other face. They understood how delicate the balance was, how a single valve, a mistimed reaction, a misread number could unleash what no wall could hold. Radiation had no colour, no taste, no sound. It drifted unseen, sometimes unnoticed, until years later, when its mark appeared on bodies and landscapes alike. Still, people believed. They trusted the promise more than the warning. In towns near the first plants, families looked at the smooth cooling towers and the harmless white steam that drifted upward. They were told this was progress, the cleanest energy of the modern age. Few could imagine the quiet hum within, or how close the edge always lay. The dawn of atomic power was not bright and steady like the rising sun. It was a flickering flame, fragile yet ferocious, both promise and peril. Across the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France and beyond, that flame was carried forward, built into machines, hidden behind thick doors, allowed to hum beneath fields where children still played. It was a beginning shaped by ambition, by pride, by the belief that humanity could hold the fire of creation in its hands without being burned. But beginnings carry shadows. And already in the silence of control rooms and the whispers of cautious scientists, there was an unease that would one day prove impossible to ignore. For now, though, the world moved forward with its new fire. It was a time of optimism, of gleaming towers, of leaders speaking of endless energy. The story had only just begun. And in that quiet beginning, the boundaries of human power had already shifted, though no one yet knew how far the consequences would reach. When the mushroom clouds of war drifted into memory, the world found itself standing at a crossroads, looking at the atom not as a weapon, but as a key. In the stillness that followed the destruction, governments and scientists began to speak in gentler tones, reshaping the image of nuclear power from one of devastation to one of hope. The same force that had flattened cities, they said, could now light them. The same reaction that had shaken the earth could now run silently in carefully tended machines, producing energy that seemed almost pure. It was an age hungry for renewal. Cities scarred by bombings rebuilt themselves with steel and glass. Streets that had once echoed with the march of soldiers now filled with cars, neon lights, and radios playing music that felt like a promise of modern life. Everywhere, there was a sense of moving forward, of reaching toward something brighter. Into this atmosphere, nuclear power was introduced not as a shadow of fear, but as a beacon of progress. The rhetoric was careful, deliberate. Scientists spoke of energy too cheap to meter, a phrase that lingered in the imagination like a lullaby of modernity. Politicians pointed to the clean chimneys of reactors, releasing only clouds of steam instead of the dark smoke of coal. Newspapers described a future where electricity would never run short, where industry would flourish, and where homes would glow with light pulled not from burning forests or drilling oil, but from the heart of matter itself. Nuclear energy was sold as progress embodied, a silent engine that would drive humanity into a new age of abundance. This was not just a technical promise, but a cultural one. In classrooms, children drew pictures of smiling suns and glowing power plants. Postcards showed futuristic cities powered by the atom, their streets lined with smooth highways and electric railways that seemed to glide effortlessly. At world fairs, models of reactors were displayed like sculptures of tomorrow. In living rooms, families listened as broadcasters described nuclear-powered ships that could sail without refueling, planes that might one day cross the globe without landing, even dreams of colonies on the moon powered by tiny reactors no larger than a desk. The atom was no longer hidden in laboratories or behind barbed wire. It was presented as something friendly, even domestic. Toys were made in the shape of reactors. Cookbooks spoke of foods irradiated for preservation, free from bacteria and spoilage. Medicine too found its uses, with radiation offered as both treatment and miracle. For many, the atom had been transformed from a force of terror into a companion of daily life, a quiet presence that seemed to whisper of endless possibility. And yet, behind the polished speeches and cheerful posters, the reality was far more fragile. Nuclear reactors were complex machines, each one depending on countless valves, pipes, and control rods, each demanding precision that could not always be guaranteed. Engineers worked tirelessly to maintain safety, but the systems were new, untested on the scale now being attempted. In their notebooks, in technical journals, quiet warnings were written, concerns about cooling systems, about the disposal of waste, about the possibility of human error in a system where even the smallest misstep could unravel the balance. But the public was rarely told of such details. To admit the risks would have been to dim the glow of progress. And so the optimism continued, unbroken. Nuclear power plants began to rise across landscapes like monuments of the modern world. In the United States, sleek domes appeared near rivers. In the Soviet Union, massive facilities were built in both cities and remote countrysides. Britain, France, and Japan all joined in, each nation eager to claim its place in the new era. Reactors became symbols not only of energy, but of national pride. Inside the control rooms, the atmosphere was far different than the speeches outside. Operators sat in front of panels filled with blinking lights and dials, listening to the hum of machinery that never truly rested. There was a weight in the air, a recognition that the atom was never fully tamed, only guided. The chain reaction within the core was relentless, a process that demanded constant attention. Cooling water had to flow without interruption. Graphite rods had to move precisely when commanded. Every moment was a balance, a dance of forces invisible to the eye, yet powerful enough to alter landscapes if mishandled. Still, there was a strange calm to it all. Workers grew accustomed to the rhythm of their shifts, to the steady sound of pumps and turbines, to the quiet reassurance of gauges holding steady. They went home at night, ate dinner with their families, and spoke with pride about their work. Many truly believed they were building a safer world, one in which energy would flow freely and wars over fuel would become relics of the past. This quiet confidence spread outward into the societies that surrounded the plants. Towns grew near the reactors, their streets lined with houses for workers, schools for their children, markets that flourished under the steady hum of electricity. In these places, the reactor was not seen as a danger, but as a benefactor. It provided jobs, stability, and a sense of belonging to something larger than the town itself. People grew used to its silhouette on the horizon, the white plume of steam rising like a harmless cloud against the sky. Yet the silence of this age carried within it another kind of silence, one less visible. It was the silence of unspoken fears, of questions left unanswered. What would happen to the waste, the spent fuel that remained dangerous for centuries? What if the cooling systems failed? What if the invisible radiation escaped into the air? These questions were asked in quiet corners, often by scientists themselves, but they rarely reached the public in ways that stirred concern. The narrative of progress was too strong, the promises too alluring. The balance of faith and risk shaped the years that followed. Nuclear submarines slipped silently beneath the oceans, powered by reactors no one could see. Entire cities drew their electricity from plants that hummed day and night. Governments poured money into expanding the programs, racing not only for energy but for influence, for the prestige of being a leader in the atomic age. The silent promises of this era were as intoxicating as they were fragile. They spoke of a future where scarcity was erased, where progress had no limits. But beneath them lay the same reality that had been present from the very first splitting of the atom. That such power came not as a gift, but as a responsibility. A single mistake could shatter the illusion. A single failure could turn the dream into something darker. For now, though, the silence held. Cities glowed with new light, and the atom seemed to have been bent toward peace. Children slept under electric lamps, powered by forces they could not imagine, while in the distance, the cooling towers released their steady clouds of steam into the night sky. The world, lulled by these promises, moved forward with a quiet confidence. But within the silence, the seeds of future disaster were already being planted, unnoticed, waiting. The glow of progress spread across the mid-20th century like a carefully drawn painting, each brushstroke showing towers of concrete, smooth domes of steel, and chimneys breathing out clouds of white that looked harmless against the sky. Governments promised light without end. Scientists spoke of technology guiding the future, and societies settled into the comfort of believing the atom had been placed firmly in human hands. Yet progress has always carried shadows, and the atom was no exception. For all its quiet hum, nuclear power was never entirely what it seemed. Inside the walls of each reactor, beyond the smiling photographs in newspapers, lay an energy that was both precise and unforgiving. A chain reaction once started could not simply be stopped. It could only be managed, slowed, or guided. The machinery built to control it was intricate, demanding, and merciless toward error. While the public saw symbols of safety, those who worked closest to the reactors understood that a constant tension lived beneath the calm surface. Small incidents began to appear, though most went unnoticed outside the circles of engineers and regulators. A valve that stuck, a reading on a dial that rose too quickly, a worker who absorbed more radiation than anyone had expected. These moments rarely made headlines. They were written into reports, studied in technical meetings, and sometimes quietly forgotten. Yet with each one, the fragility of the system revealed itself. Nuclear power required perfection, and perfection is not a condition that human hands can sustain indefinitely. The shadow grew not only in the risks of accidents, but also in the byproducts of success. For every megawatt of electricity produced, for every city illuminated, there remained the matter of waste. Spent fuel, still alive with radiation, had to be stored with care. Barrels were lowered into pools of water, buried beneath earth, or hidden in vaults designed to last for centuries. But the question lingered: what structure could last as long as the danger itself? Generations would pass, governments would rise and fall, yet the waste remained, glowing quietly in its containment, waiting with a patience far longer than human memory. There was also the matter of secrecy. Nuclear power was never entirely separate from nuclear weapons, and this closeness bred a culture of silence. Accidents were downplayed, reports classified, questions left unanswered. The public, reassured with promises of safety, rarely saw the full picture. But inside the industry, engineers whispered about close calls, about near misses where luck, more than planning, had kept disaster from unfolding. Each silence became another layer of the shadow that followed the atom, unseen yet present. And then there was the human cost, quiet, invisible, often denied. Workers in uranium mines, far from the shining plants of modern cities, breathed in dust that clung to their lungs. Soldiers sent to observe nuclear tests returned with illnesses no one wanted to connect to radiation. Villages near facilities saw changes in health that were whispered about but seldom recorded officially. Radiation did not roar like fire, nor choke like smoke. It slipped silently into bodies, leaving its mark slowly, often years after the exposure. To many, the danger seemed unreal because it could not be seen, heard, or touched. But the shadow it cast was long, and it spread farther than anyone wished to admit. The optimism of the nuclear age had always depended on trust. People trusted scientists to manage the unseen forces, trusted governments to keep them safe, trusted that the technology was as flawless as it was presented. But in the quiet corners of laboratories and control rooms, doubts lingered. What would happen in a true failure? What if the chain reaction slipped beyond control? If the cooling stopped? if the containment failed? The answers, though imagined in simulations and calculations, were seldom spoken aloud, for they revealed scenarios so devastating that even those who studied them hoped they would remain only theory. Still, the world pressed forward. More reactors rose. More energy flowed into grids. More cities lit their streets with nuclear power. And with each new construction, the shadow deepened, for every plant was both a promise and a risk. The balance held, but it held with a fragility that few outside the industry understood. To most, the atom was a friend, a silent provider of light. To those who saw the shadows, it was a companion that demanded constant vigilance, a fire that could not be allowed to slip from its boundaries. Even nature itself offered reminders of fragility. Earthquakes rattled regions where reactors stood. Storms tested the resilience of cooling systems. Rivers that supplied the lifeblood of water for reactors sometimes ran low in summer heat. Each challenge revealed how closely these machines were tied to forces beyond human control. They were not isolated from the world, but deeply dependent on it, and the world was not always predictable. As the decades turned, the gap between the promise and the shadow widened. Nuclear power became both admired and feared. It was celebrated as clean, modern, and efficient, yet whispered about as dangerous, unpredictable, and unforgiving. The disasters had not yet fully arrived, but the conditions for them were quietly gathering. The silence of the age was no longer entirely comforting. It was the kind of silence in which something waited, unseen but inevitable. And so the world moved deeper into the atomic age, carried forward by its own ambitions. Towns continued to grow around plants. Children continued to play in the fields nearby. Families continued to switch on lamps, powered by forces hidden beneath concrete walls. But all the while, the shadows beneath the atom stretched further, reaching into places no one could yet see, preparing to show themselves in ways that would not be easily forgotten. In the quiet countryside of northern England, among rolling fields and villages where life followed the rhythm of seasons, there rose a facility that seemed to belong to another age. It was vast, industrial, and solemn, its towers and chimneys standing against the horizon with a kind of austere certainty. To those who lived nearby, it was simply Windscale, a name spoken with both pride and a little mystery. Behind its walls, the atom was being harnessed not just for energy, but for purposes far larger than anyone in the surrounding farms or market towns could truly know. Windscale had been built in haste, born of a world that was not yet free from rivalry. The Second World War had ended, but its shadow lingered. Nations had seen what the atom could do when split for destruction, and no government was willing to remain vulnerable. Britain, determined not to fall behind the United States or the Soviet Union, set its scientists to work, and on the Cumbrian coast, the reactors rose. Officially, they were described as part of the march toward peaceful energy, but their true heart was darker. They were designed to produce plutonium, the substance that fed atomic weapons. To those who worked within the plant, it was a place of constant watchfulness. The reactors were cooled not by water, but by air, drawn in through great fans that hummed day and night. Graphite moderated the reactions inside, and uranium fuel was loaded in long channels that passed through the core. It was a complex design, functional but flawed, created under pressure to deliver results quickly. Engineers tended it with care, adjusting controls, monitoring dials, ensuring the invisible fire at the heart of the reactor remained contained. For a time, it seemed to work. Electricity flowed, and plutonium was produced. Yet beneath the orderly operation, problems began to gather. Heat built unevenly inside the graphite, pockets of energy that could not always be measured or predicted. The channels grew hotter than expected, and the cooling system, designed in the rush of post-war ambition, struggled to maintain balance. Workers noticed quirks and irregularities, but the pressure to keep the program moving forward was immense. Britain needed results, and hesitation was not easily accepted. The autumn of 1957 arrived cool and damp, the kind of season where mist rolled gently across the fields. At Windscale, preparations were made for an operation known as annealing, an attempt to release stored energy from the graphite by carefully raising temperatures. It was a delicate procedure, one that carried risks, yet it was necessary to keep the reactor functioning. On October 8th, the process began, watched closely by those in the control room. At first, the readings seemed manageable, but deep within the core, the heat gathered more quickly than expected. Gauges flickered higher, and operators began to notice signs that something was not right. Air moved through the channels, but the heat did not fall as it should have. Instead, it climbed. By October 10th, it was clear that something within the reactor had slipped beyond control. A fire had begun, not of wood or coal, but of uranium, a blaze invisible yet deadly, burning in the hidden heart of the machine. It was not a fire that roared with flames or smoke. It was slower, more insidious, feeding on the fuel itself, releasing radiation as it burned. The workers could not see it directly, but they knew from the instruments, from the rising temperatures, from the uneasy silence that fell over the control room. Men were sent to check the channels, and some reported a faint red glow deep inside, a glimpse of the hidden flames that threatened to consume the reactor. Desperation followed. Efforts were made to smother the fire by reducing airflow, but the blaze persisted. Water was considered, yet water meeting burning uranium risked an explosion of hydrogen. Hours stretched into days, and the danger grew. Radiation began to leak, though no one outside the facility was told. The decision was made to push forward with water despite the risks. Hoses were brought, streams directed into the core, and slowly, uncertainly, the flames subsided. When the fire was finally brought under control, relief filled the plant, but the damage had already been done. A vast plume of radioactive particles had been carried into the air, spread by the same fans that had once cooled the reactor. Across the countryside, invisible dust settled on fields and villages. Milk from nearby farms was contaminated, and thousands of litres were destroyed in silence, poured away before they could reach families. The public was told little, reassured that all was well, even as the land bore the quiet mark of radiation. Windscale's fire became the first great nuclear disaster of the modern age, though at the time, its scale was softened by secrecy. Newspapers mentioned an incident, but did not describe the true extent. The government, wary of panic and international embarrassment, concealed much of what had happened. Only those who had been inside the plant, who had breathed the smoke of graphite and uranium, understood how close the world had come to something far worse. The fire left behind a wound that did not heal quickly. The reactor was damaged beyond repair, sealed and left as a monument to both ambition and oversight. Workers who had stood close to the flames carried with them exposures that would shape their health in years to come. The surrounding land, though still green and alive, bore traces of contamination that no plough or rainfall could erase entirely. Yet the world, restless as always, moved forward. Windscale was remembered, but not as a warning strong enough to halt progress. The silent promises of nuclear energy still glowed brightly in the minds of nations, and one disaster, however sobering, was not enough to dim them. Instead, the shadows deepened. Other reactors continued to rise. Other programs expanded, and the lessons of Windscale were carried forward not always with caution, but sometimes with forgetfulness. The hidden flames of that October did more than scorch a reactor. They revealed the truth that lay beneath every nuclear program, that the atom, no matter how carefully managed, carried within it the possibility of slipping free, of burning beyond control, of releasing its invisible burden into the air. The disaster whispered of fragility, of the fine line between order and chaos, but the whisper was often drowned out by the louder voices of progress. And so, while the countryside of Cumbria returned to its ordinary rhythms, while children once again walked to school past farms where milk was now safe to drink, the memory of the fire lingered. It remained in the sealed ruins of the reactor, in the quiet illnesses of workers, in the classified pages of reports that told more than the public was ever allowed to know. Windscale had burned, and though its flames were hidden, their shadows stretched into the future, following the atom wherever it went. Far from the coasts of England, deep within the Soviet Union, another story of the atom was taking shape. Beyond the forests of the Urals, past villages where roads turned to dirt and rivers cut slowly through the land, there stood a secret city. It did not appear on maps, and its name was not spoken in newspapers. Known only by a number to outsiders, it was called Chelyabinsk 40, a closed settlement built around the Mayak production facility. Here in guarded halls and behind barbed fences, the Soviet nuclear program pushed forward with relentless determination. The place was designed to remain hidden. Families who lived there knew little of the full work being done, and outsiders were never meant to ask questions. What emerged from its reactors was not electricity for homes, but plutonium for weapons. The Cold War had tightened its grip, and in Moscow, the drive to match or outpace the United States was absolute. Mayak was a cornerstone of that ambition, and secrecy wrapped it like a second skin. For years, the waste produced by its operations had been handled with little caution. Liquid effluents were poured into nearby rivers and lakes, their surfaces rippling quietly as though nothing were wrong. Containers of radioactive sludge were buried hastily, their walls thin and untested. To those in charge, the urgency of production outweighed concerns of the unseen. Radiation was invisible, and silence could cover what the eye could not. By 1957, the facility had grown crowded with storage tanks. Massive steel containers filled with highly radioactive waste, each one buried in concrete and soil to keep its dangerous contents from escaping. They stood in rows, humming softly with heat, for the reactions inside never truly stopped. It was a temporary solution, designed in haste, and already the tanks showed signs of strain. Cooling systems, meant to keep the waste stable, worked tirelessly, but like all machines, they were not immune to failure. On an unremarkable night in late September, one of those systems failed. A cooling device on a buried tank broke down, and without the steady removal of heat, the contents began to warm. Slowly, silently, over the course of days, the temperature rose. Within the tank, chemical reactions stirred, gases formed, pressure built. No alarm spread through the surrounding villages. No siren broke the stillness. Life continued as usual. Families ate dinners in small wooden houses. Children slept under the watch of autumn skies. Yet beneath the ground, danger grew. When the moment came, it was sudden and vast. The tank erupted in a violent chemical explosion, shattering its concrete casing and sending a column of fire and debris into the night sky. The blast tore through the facility, scattering fragments across the ground, and released a deadly cloud of radioactive material into the air. The silence of the Ural forests was broken, but only for a moment, before it closed again around the disaster, carrying it outward on the wind. The plume stretched for hundreds of kilometers, drifting over fields, forests, and villages. Invisible particles settled onto soil and water, onto crops and rooftops, into the very breath of those who lived beneath it. People noticed strange dust, a faint shimmer on the ground, but most did not understand what it was. Some grew ill within days, their bodies weakened by exposure, livestock sickened, and plants withered in patches where the contamination was heaviest. Yet no official word came. The Soviet state, determined to keep its secrets, remained silent. In the days that followed, entire villages were quietly evacuated, though many were given no explanation. Trucks arrived, orders were given, belongings abandoned. Families were taken away from homes their ancestors had built, from fields they had farmed for generations. The land they left behind was contaminated, turned into a silent zone that no one would be allowed to return to. Forests stood unchanged to the eye, rivers still flowed, but the soil itself had been altered, carrying within it a poison that would last for centuries. Those who lived farther from the immediate path of the plume were not warned at all. They continued to draw water from wells, to gather mushrooms from forests, to milk their cows and bake their bread. Radiation seeped into their lives quietly, leaving no mark that could be easily seen, only sickness that grew slowly in the years to come. Doctors noticed patterns, cancers, birth defects, illnesses that spread without clear cause, but the connection to the accident remained hidden, buried beneath layers of secrecy. The disaster came to be known later as the Kishtim accident, named not for the secret city where it occurred, but for a nearby town whose name could be spoken without revealing the facility. At the time, however, most of the world knew nothing of it at all. Information leaked slowly, carried by whispers and fragments, pieced together by outsiders only decades later. For those who had lived through it, there was no need for names. They remembered the sudden departure, the sickness, the emptiness where their villages had stood. The land itself bore the longest scars. A vast stretch of countryside, later called the East Ural Radioactive Trace, remained poisoned. Forests turned to silent zones where no one could live, where soil and water carried contamination that resisted decay. Wildlife returned in time, but it was marked, altered, part of a landscape that had been reshaped by the quiet night of that explosion. Inside the Soviet Union, the event was spoken of only in closed rooms, its details locked in classified files. Workers were sworn to secrecy. Families told little more than what was necessary to ensure obedience. For years, the official story remained that nothing unusual had happened, that life continued as before. But those who had seen the flash, who had felt the ground tremble, who had been forced from their homes, carried a truth that could not be erased. The quiet night of Kishtim revealed a truth that echoed far beyond the Urals, that nuclear power, when paired with secrecy and haste, could wound not only the workers who tended it, but entire landscapes, entire generations. It showed how easily a promise of progress could unravel into devastation, how the atom, once loosed from its bounds, carried consequences that no decree or silence could contain. And still, the world outside remained largely unaware. The great powers continued their programs, continued to build and expand, continued to speak of progress. The quiet night of Kishtim was hidden in the folds of history, a shadow that stretched but was not seen clearly until much later. Yet for those who lived in its path, the memory never left. It lingered in abandoned homes, in the overgrown outlines of once living villages, in the forests where silence fell heavier than before. The story of Kishtim was not told in the newspapers of its time, nor in the speeches of leaders. It was written instead in the soil, in the water, in the bodies of those who carried its invisible burden. It was a reminder that even when the night is still, even when the world seems calm, the atom can move quietly into places it was never meant to go, leaving behind shadows that last far longer than the silence in which they were born. The winds that carried the poison dust across the forests of the Urals eventually disappeared into the great turning of the earth, and far to the east, another ocean waited. The Pacific stretched endlessly, its surface calm and shimmering. But beneath the waves and scattered across its atolls, another story of the atom was unfolding. This one not born from secret factories, but from deliberate fire. In the years after the Second World War, when mushroom clouds had already risen above Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States looked out upon the Pacific as a testing ground. To them, these remote islands were far enough from their cities, far enough from the eyes of the public, that the atom could be studied in its most violent form. Atolls like Bikini and Enuatak, coral rings of sand and palm trees, became silent laboratories where weapons of unimaginable power would be unleashed. The ocean lapped gently against the shores, even as preparations were laid in steel and concrete. Palm trees swayed under the same winds that had always carried seabirds overhead, but soon the islands were cleared of their native people, told to leave their ancestral lands with promises of return. Villages were abandoned, churches left behind, graves untended. Canoes that had once sailed freely across lagoons were replaced with ships carrying instruments, soldiers, and scientists. In 1946, the first series of post-war tests, named Operation Crossroads, shook the waters at Bikini. 2 bombs were detonated, one from the air and one beneath the sea. Cameras captured the spectacle, the ocean rising upward in a towering column, ships tossed aside like toys, clouds boiling into the sky. The world was shown these images, framed as proof of progress, as demonstrations of strength. But in the blue water of the lagoon, fish floated lifeless, coral was shattered, and radioactive particles spread invisibly through the currents. This was only the beginning. The testing continued year after year as devices grew larger and more powerful. What had once been measured in kilotons grew into megatons, each blast magnitudes greater than the one before. The islanders, relocated to nearby atolls, began to feel the weight of exile. Promises of return faded with time, replaced by new assurances that soon proved hollow. Their lands were no longer safe, their lagoons now cradles of invisible danger. It was in March of 1954 that the Pacific bore witness to one of the most devastating nuclear accidents in history. On Bikini Atoll, the United States prepared to test a weapon of staggering size, a thermonuclear device codenamed Castle Bravo. It was expected to yield 6 megatons, but when the bomb ignited in the pre-dawn darkness, it roared with nearly twice that power, 15 megatons, the largest the nation had ever unleashed. The sky lit up as though dawn had come early, and then the ocean boiled. A blinding flash gave way to a rising column of fire and ash, a cloud that climbed higher than the eye could follow. The blast tore apart the island itself, vaporizing sand and coral, hurling them upward to join the radioactive cloud that spread with the winds. The Pacific, vast and unbroken, carried the fallout far beyond the test site. Unseen, the particles drifted across the sea, settling on ships, waves, and distant islands. On Rongelap, some 80 miles away, children played beneath what they thought was snow. White flakes fell from the sky, gathering on rooftops and shoulders, soft and silent. They tasted it, curious, not knowing it carried death within it. Within hours, skin burned, nausea rose, and hair began to fall. Generations of sickness followed, written into the bodies of those who had once lived in harmony with the tides. Farther still, beyond the islands, a Japanese fishing boat named Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was caught in the path of the fallout. Its crew had no warning. The dust settled onto their deck and into their lungs, clinging to their clothes and skin. By the time they returned to port, they were gravely ill. their health broken by the invisible poison. One fisherman, Aikichi Kubayama, would not survive, and his death carried the disaster across oceans, into the newspapers and consciousness of the world. The reaction was swift. Protests arose in Japan, where memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still raw, and where the suffering of the fishermen was seen as another scar left by nuclear ambition. The incident reverberated across continents, forcing even those who had seen the Pacific only on maps to understand that the ocean could not contain what had been unleashed upon it. The fallout did not respect distance. It travelled on winds and waters, carried into bodies and soil alike. For the islanders of the Marshall Islands, however, the disaster was not a headline, but a lifelong inheritance. Their homes remained poisoned. Their children bore the marks of radiation. Their lands no longer safe to till or inhabit. Promises of return gave way to compensation, and then to apologies. Yet the ocean never gave back what had been taken. The atolls, once places of song and fishing, became symbols of absence, of exile, of lives broken by a chain reaction no one could see. The Pacific, vast and seemingly eternal, absorbed these blasts quietly, but even the ocean could not erase them. Beneath the waves, craters scarred the seabed, lagoons glowed faintly in ways no eye could see, and corals struggled to regrow. For centuries, these traces will remain, reminders of a time when islands became stages for fire. The story of the Pacific tests revealed another face of nuclear disaster, not an accident hidden behind factory walls or a tank buried in concrete, but devastation carried openly into the world, reaching far beyond the test site. It showed that even the remotest places could not remain untouched, that the ocean itself could carry forward the consequences of ambition. As years passed, treaties would be signed, limits would be placed, and tests would eventually be brought to an end. But the damage had already been done. The people of Bikini and Rongelap, of Eniwetak and Utarik, carried the memory not as history alone, but as a living reality, felt in illness, in displacement, in the empty spaces where villages once stood. And so, the Pacific joined the long and growing list of places reshaped by the atom. Forests in the Urals, fields in England, and now atolls scattered across the endless sea. Each told the same quiet truth, that when fire is born from the heart of the atom, it does not stay contained. It moves outward, across air and water, across generations, leaving behind a trail not of progress but of silence, absence, and loss. Across the great ocean, where the winds carried traces of fallout and the tides moved with silent persistence, a river wound its way through the state of Pennsylvania. Along its banks lay farmland, small towns, and the quiet rhythm of American life in the late 1970s. The Susquehanna River flowed gently, its waters broad and calm, passing forests that had stood for centuries. On one stretch of this river sat a narrow island, unremarkable to the eye, but destined to carry a name that would echo in the long and uneasy history of the atom. 3 Mile Island was chosen as the site of a nuclear power plant, part of a rising wave of optimism that promised energy without smoke, power without coal, and progress wrapped in modern steel. 2 towering reactor units were built there, their cooling towers rising like silent sentinels above the water. To those who drove along the nearby highways, the plant looked like a symbol of the future, immense yet orderly, a place where the great force of the atom had been tamed for human use. The air around the island was calm in the early hours of March 28th, 1979. Birds stirred from their roosts. The river moved as it always had, and within the plant, control panels glowed softly in the dim light of the control room. Yet behind the blinking lights and humming machinery, a small malfunction began to grow. A pump failed in the secondary cooling system, cutting the flow of water needed to carry heat away from the reactor. Valves shifted, alarms sounded, and operators, confronted with a storm of information, misread the signals before them. What began as a technical hiccup unfolded into confusion. A relief valve stuck open, unnoticed in the flurry of flashing lights, allowing coolant to escape. As the minutes passed, the water that kept the reactor's core stable diminished, and the uranium fuel began to heat beyond its limits. In the hidden heart of the reactor, fuel rods blistered and cracked. Though contained within thick walls of steel and concrete, the damage was real, and the line between control and disaster grew thin. For those working inside, the situation was obscured by uncertainty. Instruments contradicted one another, and human judgment faltered in the noise of alarms. Decisions were made under pressure, some of them wrong, and with each passing hour, the reactor slipped further into crisis. It was not a sudden explosion, not a fire, or a blast like those that had scarred other places, but a slow unravelling, a chain of errors and oversights that pushed the machine toward failure. Beyond the plant's gates, the morning unfolded like any other. Commuters drove to work, children boarded school buses, shopkeepers lifted shutters and swept their steps. Few knew what was happening on the island, though soon whispers began to spread. Radio stations spoke of an incident. Officials gave vague reassurances, and uncertainty drifted across the valley like a haze. Parents wondered if their children were safe at school, neighbours asked one another if they should leave, and rumours grew faster than facts could catch them. Inside homes, television sets flickered with updates, though the words were often more confusing than clear. Some reports spoke of radiation releases, others of minor malfunctions, and no one seemed entirely certain what was unfolding behind the tall concrete towers. The public, caught between reassurance and dread, looked toward the horizon where the plant stood, its towers still steaming into the air, as though nothing had changed. As the hours stretched into days, thousands of families made choices in the quiet of their living rooms. Some packed hurriedly, loading children and belongings into cars, heading for relatives in distant towns. Others stayed, hoping the officials were right, clinging to the belief that all would be contained. Gas stations filled with lines of vehicles, highways grew crowded, and the valley, usually calm, trembled with unease. The reactor itself teetered on the edge, its core partially melted, the fuel rods collapsing inward, though contained within the heavy vessel. Radiation seeped into the plant, and small amounts into the air outside, but not enough to bring visible devastation. The danger was invisible, abstract, measured in units most could not understand, yet felt as a weight in the chest, as the fear that the air itself might be unsafe to breathe. In the end, the worst did not come. The reactor did not rupture, the containment held, and the feared release of vast radiation into the valley was avoided. But the damage, though unseen, was lasting. Inside the reactor, the core lay ruined, a twisted reminder of how narrow the line was between energy and disaster. And outside, in the minds of those who had lived through those anxious days, the trust in nuclear power had been shaken deeply. The name 3 Mile Island became a ghost, a phrase that lingered in conversations, in news headlines, in debates across the nation. Politicians spoke of safety, scientists argued over risks, and ordinary people remembered the confusion and fear that had filled their homes. The plant itself remained, one reactor eventually restarted, the other forever closed. The towers continued to rise above the river, but they no longer inspired the same quiet confidence. The ghosts of 3 Mile Island were not born only from the reactor, but from the silence, the uncertainty, the way truth seemed to shift and blur in those crucial hours. Families recalled the unease of not knowing, of being caught between reassurance and fear, of wondering whether their children were safe, whether their homes might be touched by something unseen and permanent. For years afterward, the accident haunted public opinion. Plans for new plants slowed, protests grew, and the idea of nuclear power as a simple promise of clean energy dimmed. The Susquehanna still flowed, steady and calm, but in its reflection, the cooling towers seemed less like symbols of progress and more like monuments to fragility. 3 Mile Island was not the deadliest of nuclear disasters, not by measure of lives lost or land scarred, yet its impact reached deeply into imagination and memory. It reminded the world that disaster need not always come with fire and ash. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through missteps and misunderstandings, leaving behind uncertainty that lingers long after the machines are shut down. And so the island remains, its story carried on by those who lived through the anxious days of 1979. It sits within the larger chain of places, marked by the atom's restless power, another quiet entry in the long tale of ambition, error, and consequence. The ghosts of 3 Mile Island walk not in the streets, but in the hesitation that followed, in the shift of public trust, in the knowledge that even in the calm heart of America, the atom could stir unease that would never fully fade. The river in Pennsylvania had carried its unease quietly downstream, and far away, another river moved through the forests of Ukraine. Along its banks lay a new kind of city, built with the precision of planners and the optimism of engineers. Pripyat was not old like the villages that dotted the Urals, nor small like the towns along the Susquehanna. It was young, rising from the ground in the 1970s as a showcase of modern life in the Soviet Union. Apartment blocks stood in neat rows, their windows catching the sun as children laughed in courtyards below. Schools, theatres, swimming pools and shops offered the comforts of a city designed with confidence. Pripyat was a place where the future seemed clear, where workers of the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant could live with their families, surrounded by the assurance that they were part of something grand. On April mornings, the air carried the scent of damp earth and budding trees. Spring had arrived, and the city felt alive with renewal. On one particular Saturday, the 26th of April, in 1986, the day began like so many others. The sky was calm, the breeze gentle, and the people of Pripyat stirred from their sleep to the ordinary sounds of their neighbours rising for work, of children preparing for school, of streets slowly filling with footsteps. Yet a few kilometres away, in the shadow of the tall chimneys of reactor number 4, the heart of the atom once again broke free from human command. Inside the plant, a test was underway, meant to measure how the reactor would perform under specific conditions. It was a routine exercise, but one layered with missteps, delays, and decisions that pressed the reactor into a state it was never meant to endure. As night gave way to dawn, control rods were raised too high, safeguards disabled, and the reactor grew unstable. In the stillness of early morning, the machine surged with a force its operators could not contain. At 1:23 a.m., a pair of explosions tore through reactor number 4, shattering its concrete and steel, blowing its heavy lid aside like a discarded toy. Fire shot into the sky, and with it a cloud of radioactive particles began to rise, carried upward by the heat of destruction. The plant itself became a furnace. Flames leapt across the roof, graphite blocks burned with an intensity no water could quench, and smoke twisted upward, black at first, then turning to an invisible haze that drifted silently into the atmosphere. The night was pierced by the blue glow of ionized air, an eerie light seen by firefighters who rushed to the scene, unaware of the invisible danger clinging to every breath they took. In Pripyat, however, The morning unfolded as though nothing had changed. The sun rose over tidy streets, and families stepped out of their apartments into the cool air. Children rode bicycles, couples strolled hand in hand, and buses ferried workers to their shifts. Few knew what had happened in the dark hours before dawn. The fire still burned at the plant. Helicopters already began circling overhead, but the city itself remained calm, untouched by immediate alarm. Some noticed strange sights. A metallic taste lingered on the tongue, as though the air itself had thickened. Light shimmered oddly in the distance, and those who walked near the river or fields felt a faint nausea. But these were passing sensations, easily dismissed, for no warning came. No sirens wailed through the streets. No announcements broke over the radio. The people of Pripyat continued their morning routines, unaware that the world around them had shifted in ways they could not yet see. The invisible cloud spread across rooftops and courtyards, settling into gardens, onto laundry lines, onto the skin and hair of children playing in the open air. In schools, lessons carried on. In shops, shelves were stocked, lines formed, and purchases made. The rhythm of life continued, but every breath carried traces of radiation, every moment binding the people of Pripyat more tightly to the disaster that had begun just beyond their city. Firefighters battled the blaze at the plant with no protection against the radiation. They climbed ladders with hoses, their boots melting against the heat, their hands blistering. Within hours, many would collapse, their bodies overwhelmed by doses that no training had prepared them for. Yet in Pripyat, only kilometers away, life continued in its ordinary patterns. A wedding took place, couples celebrated, children filled playgrounds with laughter, and the spring morning unfolded as if untouched. It was not until late in the day that whispers of unease began to drift through the city. Parents noticed children becoming ill, vomiting, dizzy, feverish. Workers returning from the plant carried stories of something gone terribly wrong, though details were scarce. The authorities, bound by layers of secrecy, hesitated to act, weighing the cost of alarm against the need for silence. By the time decisions were made, the cloud had already spread far beyond the city, carried across fields, rivers, and into the skies over Europe. On April 27th, buses finally arrived. Long lines of vehicles filled the streets, their engines humming softly, as families were told to gather belongings for a short evacuation. 3 days, they were told, nothing more. People packed lightly, leaving behind pets, furniture, photographs, convinced they would soon return. They boarded the buses in orderly fashion, children pressing their faces to the windows, watching as their city slipped away behind them. The evacuation of Pripyat was calm, almost surreal. Streets that had been full only hours earlier grew quiet, the sound of engines fading into the distance. Curtains stirred in the breeze from open windows, toys lay abandoned in courtyards, laundry hung half dry on lines. The city was emptied in a single day, left standing silent, its life paused in mid-motion. The people never returned. What was meant to be temporary became permanent, as the contamination that spread from Reactor 4 made Pripyat uninhabitable for centuries to come. Grass began to push through cracks in pavement, trees sprouted in courtyards, and animals roamed where humans once lived. The city became a monument to absence, a place frozen in time, carrying the memory of that spring morning in every silent street. The disaster at Chernobyl carried far beyond Pripyat. Radiation spread across Europe, detected in Sweden, Germany and beyond, revealing the scale of the accident that secrecy could no longer conceal. It became one of the darkest symbols of the nuclear age, not only for the devastation it caused, but for the silence that shrouded it in its first hours, for the way ordinary life in Pripyat had continued beneath a sky already filled with invisible fire. The spring morning in Pripyat remains etched in memory as a moment when life and catastrophe overlapped so seamlessly that they were almost indistinguishable. A day when children played under cherry blossoms while radiation drifted unseen through the air. A day when a city lived its last ordinary hours, unaware it was already a ghost. And in the stillness of its abandoned apartments, in the schools where notebooks still rest on desks, in the fairground where a Ferris wheel waits forever for riders, the echoes of that morning remain. They linger not as noise, but as silence, an unbroken reminder of how fragile the thread of safety can be, and how quickly it can unravel when the atom escapes its bounds. The buses pulled away from Pripyat, their windows filled with faces pressed against the glass, watching the familiar streets disappear behind them. The city sank into silence, not the silence of night, but a stillness that would never end. The wind moved through courtyards and across playgrounds, carrying with it the invisible weight of radiation that clung to every surface. The world had shifted, though few yet grasped how deeply. Beyond the abandoned streets, the reactor itself still smouldered. Flames glowed through the shattered skeleton of reactor number 4, smoke and steam twisting upward in slow spirals. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dropping sand, boron, and lead in desperate attempts to smother the fire. Pilots leaned into their controls, flying low, absorbing doses of radiation each time they passed through the plume. The air was heavy with particles that carried no sound, no smell, no colour, yet they spread into soil, water, and bodies with quiet persistence. For days, the fire raged. The structure cracked and groaned, threatening to collapse further, to open the wound wider. Workers known as liquidators were summoned by the thousands, pulled from across the Soviet Union, to confront something that could not be touched without consequence. Soldiers, miners, engineers, and volunteers moved through the poison zone in shifts so brief that their minutes were counted, their time limited by the unseen force around them. They shoveled graphite from rooftops, dug trenches, built barriers, each action drawing them closer to the threshold of what a body could endure. The plant became a battlefield without the sound of gunfire, where the enemy was measured in millisieverts and half-lives rather than weapons and armour. Many did not last long after their work ended. Hospitals filled with men whose hands trembled, whose skin burned from within, whose organs faltered one after another. Their sacrifice was not marked by parades or songs, but by quiet burial in sealed coffins, lowered into earth far from their families. The shadow of Chernobyl spread across borders, carried by wind currents that paid no heed to maps. In Sweden, scientists detected unusual levels of radiation and traced the pattern backward, discovering what the Soviet authorities had not yet admitted. Across Europe, traces of cesium and iodine settled on pastures, in rivers, on crops. Farmers slaughtered livestock, governments monitored milk supplies, and ordinary people looked to the sky with unease, wondering what invisible threads were drifting down upon them. For those who had lived in Pripyat, the displacement became permanent. Families scattered to new towns and villages, given keys to unfamiliar apartments, left with nothing but the belongings they had carried on that hurried evacuation. Their homes remained behind, sealed within the exclusion zone, unreachable. Some returned in secret, unwilling to abandon the land of their birth, living in the edges of the zone despite warnings, their lives shortened by the soil they tilled and the water they drank. The landscape changed slowly. Forests around the reactor turned a deep rust colour as radiation killed the pines, leaving behind what became known as the Red Forest, a scar visible even from the sky. Villages within 30 kilometres fell silent, their wooden houses collapsing under the weight of seasons, with no hands to maintain them. Nature began to reclaim what humanity had abandoned. Wolves prowled empty streets, wild boar rooted through gardens, and birds nested in the rafters of schools where lessons had once been recited. Life returned, but it was a life altered, growing in the cracks of human absence. The reactor itself could not simply be left to smoulder. Engineers devised a solution as monumental as it was temporary: the sarcophagus. Hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete and steel were poured and assembled around the wrecked core, sealing it beneath a rough shell. It stood as both a shield and a reminder, looming over the exclusion zone like a monument to human error. For decades it would sit, deteriorating slowly, until a new structure, larger, stronger, more enduring, would slide into place to cover it. Yet even that could not erase what lay beneath. The shadow of Chernobyl was not only physical, but psychological. Across the Soviet Union, trust fractured. The disaster revealed the fragility of secrecy, the dangers of silence, and the costs of maintaining appearances over truth. Citizens began to question, to doubt, to wonder what other truths had been hidden. In that way, Chernobyl became not just an environmental catastrophe, but a political one, its fallout spreading into conversations that had long been suppressed. Generations carried its weight. Children born in the years after were studied for effects, their health traced, their futures uncertain. The word Chernobyl itself became a mark, a whisper of danger, a reminder of what had been unleashed. Stories spread of illness, of cancers rising, of lives cut short. Some were exaggerated, some understated, but all carried the echo of fear that the atom, once released, could never truly be contained. Even far from Ukraine, the shadow lingered. Nuclear policy across the world shifted. Plans for new plants were delayed or cancelled. Safety measures tightened. Debates reignited. For decades, Chernobyl served as the spectre that haunted every discussion of nuclear power, its image seared into memory by photographs of the deserted Ferris wheel, the crumbling apartments, the empty schools. It became a symbol larger than itself, shaping how the world thought about energy, risk, and the thin line between progress and catastrophe. And yet, amid the silence of the zone, time moved on. Grass covered playgrounds, vines climbed walls, seasons layered dust and snow over the remnants of human life. In that stillness, there was an eerie beauty. Deer wandered through abandoned living rooms, trees grew through rooftops, and wildflowers pushed through cracks in the pavement. The city that had once embodied the future became a sanctuary for nature, a paradoxical refuge born from destruction. The long shadow of Chernobyl reaches forward still. The exclusion zone remains, patrolled and studied, a place both forbidden and sought after, where visitors walk through rooms left exactly as they were on that spring morning, their silence broken only by the crunch of glass beneath their shoes. It is a place where memory has weight, where the absence of people feels louder than their presence once did. And in that shadow lies a lesson, not shouted, not forced, but whispered in the quiet corridors of empty buildings and the rustling of leaves in the red forest. It speaks of the power we hold and the costs we bear, of how quickly ordinary life can vanish, and how long its absence can linger. It speaks of the resilience of nature, but also of the fragility of trust, of systems, of safety. Chernobyl is no longer only a place on a map. It is a story carried across generations, a caution carried in the marrow of history. Its long shadow does not end with the borders of the exclusion zone, nor with the fading of graphite fires. It stretches outward, into policy and memory, into the way the world thinks about the atom. It is not just a moment that passed. It is a presence that endures, quiet, heavy and unyielding, like the silence of a city left behind. The winds carried it first, drifting across borders without the courtesy of permission, scattering invisible fragments across fields and rivers, into forests and cities. To those beneath the sky, the days felt ordinary. Clouds gathered, rain fell, and children played in puddles, unaware that the drops sliding down their skin carried something more than water. The world had always trusted the sky to nourish the earth, but in those days, it brought a weight that could not be seen. Fallout did not roar as it spread. It moved softly, like a whispering mist, settling into soil where roots pulled it downward into the veins of the earth. Grasses absorbed it, cows grazed upon it, and from their milk, it entered the kitchens of families who poured it into the cups of their children. The chain was invisible, unbroken, and far-reaching. It stretched from the collapsed reactor to the smallest village, to markets and kitchens thousands of kilometers away. Rainwater pooled on rooftops, dripping steadily into gutters, while in the countryside, farmers turned their faces upward, hoping for a blessing, but receiving instead an unseen curse. The dust that fell with the rain clung to clothes and skin, washed into rivers where fish carried it deeper into currents. In northern Europe, alarms were triggered when scientists measured radiation levels in places untouched by reactors. They followed the trail back across the continent, piecing together a truth that no government could keep hidden for long. The silent fall of rain and ash was not confined to one accident or one country. It became a pattern etched into the history of the nuclear age. Every test in the Pacific, every detonation in the desert, every accident that cracked containment and released its contents, each left behind more than a headline. Ash fell over atolls where palm trees once swayed undisturbed. Rain carried strontium into wells dug by villagers who had never heard the word radiation. Across distant oceans, fishermen hauled in catches that glowed not with light, but with contamination. For those who lived close to the source, the effects appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly. A cough that lingered, fields that no longer yielded as before, livestock that weakened without clear reason. In some places, entire villages were emptied, their names left only on maps, while the buildings stood abandoned, doors open to the wind. Generations later, the silence of those places remained, their stories woven into the greater tapestry of loss that the atom had written upon the earth. The fallout blurred boundaries between war and peace. Tests meant to prove strength left trails of illness, accidents meant to be contained seeped across continents, and each event left behind not just wreckage, but a kind of inheritance. Children born in the years that followed carried the shadow in their blood, their growth measured, their health monitored, their futures made uncertain by decisions taken far beyond their control. And yet, the rain continued to fall, the seasons turned, and life pressed forward. In cities where contamination had drifted, markets reopened, families resumed their routines, and the memory of the invisible presence faded into the background noise of daily living. It was easier not to dwell on what could not be seen, easier to trust in the safety of ordinary habits, even when traces of ash still lingered in the soil. In the countryside of Belarus and Ukraine, stories emerged of families who refused to leave their ancestral land, even when told it was poisoned. They planted gardens, gathered mushrooms from forests, drew water from wells, their lives shortened by the loyalty to a place that had become part of them. The silent fall had marked their land, but to them, it was still home. Their stubborn return was less defiance than resignation, an acceptance that the earth and its dangers were bound together with memory and belonging. The silence was the most haunting part. There was no thunder in the rain, no sting in the ash. Only the knowledge, years later, that what had seemed harmless had carved deep lines into the story of human health and survival. Doctors spoke of patterns, of clusters of disease, of generations touched by something they could not see. Scientists tracked isotopes across borders, mapping where the clouds had drifted, where the rains had fallen, where the ash had settled into the dust of living rooms and barns alike. For those far from reactors or testing grounds, the silent fall became an abstraction, a distant problem contained in newspapers or the dim glow of a television report. But for those who stood in the path of the clouds, who planted in the contaminated soil, who drank from the wells that carried traces of cesium and iodine, it was a constant companion. It seeped into their routines, altering not just their health, but their sense of safety in the world. The sky, once a source of comfort, now carried with it a quiet unease. In time, the world learned to measure the silence. Instruments grew more precise, capable of detecting the faintest traces of fallout in rainwater, in milk, in the air itself. What had once been invisible became charted in numbers and graphs, and yet the comfort of measurement could not erase the truth of exposure. Knowing how much did not undo what had already entered the body, nor could it ease the weight of what might yet come. Still, the seasons turned, as they always do. Snow covered the contaminated fields. Spring thawed the rivers that carried residues farther downstream. Summer rains nourished crops that grew despite the danger beneath their roots. The silent fall of rain and ash became part of the rhythm of life, hidden in plain sight, absorbed into the cycles of nature that never paused, even when altered. The lesson of the ash was not shouted, but whispered. It showed that catastrophe did not need to come with flames and sirens alone. It could arrive softly, like dust carried on the breeze, like rain tapping gently on a window pane. It could seep into the smallest crevices of life, leaving marks that might not appear for years, yet would shape the stories of families and nations alike. The world did not stop building reactors, nor did it abandon the atom's promise. But the rain and the ash remained in memory, a reminder that what drifts silently from the sky may linger longer than any storm, shaping landscapes, bodies, and histories in ways unseen. And so the silence stretched on, heavy but unbroken, like the pause between heartbeats, carrying with it the knowledge of what had already fallen and what might one day fall again. The clouds had passed, but the traces they left behind remained etched into the ground. Beyond the perimeter fences and exclusion zones, there were places where human voices once filled the air, where children had played along dusty roads, where bells had marked the rhythm of days. Now those places lie still, villages emptied not by choice, but by necessity, their absence carved into the soil as deeply as their former presence. Wooden houses leaned beneath the weight of years, with no caretakers. Roofs sagged, doors hung open, and weeds crept slowly over thresholds where shoes had once been neatly lined. In some villages, curtains still swayed in broken windows, left behind on the morning when evacuation orders came. The silence of these homes is not merely quiet. It carries with it the residue of stories interrupted mid-sentence, of lives set down like unfinished letters. The fields beyond the villages tell the same story. They stretch outward in all directions, but their rows are no longer neat with crops. Grass rises where wheat once bent in the wind. Wildflowers scatter across the soil where farmers had bent their backs in planting. Time has softened the lines of the land, folding back the marks of cultivation until only faint traces of human labour remain. Yet beneath the surface, the soil still carries what the silent rain once delivered. The hidden inheritance that made the land unfit for the lives that once depended on it. Cattle no longer graze where fences rot into the ground. Barns, once echoing with the low sounds of animals, now stand empty except for the slow settling of dust. Wells that once drew water to quench thirst lie unused, their stones damp with rain but untrusted by human hands. In some places, apple orchards still blossom each spring, their branches heavy with fruit no one will taste. The trees offer abundance, but abundance that cannot be touched. The forgotten villages remain as though caught in a long pause. Schoolhouses still hold desks lined neatly, chalk still faintly marking lessons half erased. Playgrounds stand rusting, swings creaking in the wind, though no child runs across the grass. Churches, where candles once glowed in quiet devotion, stand hollow, their wooden icons staring silently into the air. The places of gathering, markets, community halls, the benches beneath shade trees, have become stages where only the wind performs. Those who were told to leave carried with them only what could fit into their arms. They stepped into buses and trucks, expecting to return in days, perhaps weeks. The return never came. Their absence stretched into decades, and the land reclaimed its own in their stead. Yet the memories of those who once lived there remain vivid, carried within them as though the houses still stood intact. They speak of the sound of bells on summer mornings, of the smell of bread carried on air, of the feel of soil between fingers. The land is lost, but in memory it is alive. From time to time, wanderers return to the edges of the exclusion zones. Some are elderly, unwilling to abandon the places where they were born, where every tree and path carried the familiarity of a lifetime. They return to houses with roofs collapsed, to gardens overtaken by weeds, to wells whose waters hold shadows of the past. They plant again, they tend again, even when told it is unwise. For them, the danger is secondary to the belonging, the quiet dignity of dying where they once lived. Others come not to live, but to see. Scientists walk through the forgotten fields with instruments in hand, listening for the whispers of contamination in the soil. Journalists and visitors step carefully over debris, cameras raised, recording images of absence that spread across the world. For them, the villages are symbols of disaster, of resilience, of memory preserved by silence. Yet for those who once called them home, they are more than symbols. They are fragments of lives that continue to ache with displacement. The fields themselves tell a story, not only of loss, but of transformation. With the absence of human hands, nature has surged forward. Forests stretch across fields that once grew barley and rye. Wolves, lynx and bears roam freely through spaces where they had long been absent. Storks nest on chimneys, their calls echoing over towns that no longer hear the chatter of markets or the clatter of wagons. The return of wilderness is both haunting and beautiful, a reminder that the world continues without us, that silence is not emptiness but change. And yet, despite the greenery, the places remain marked. Beneath the tall grasses lie traces of ash, isotopes that remain long after those who released them are gone. A mushroom gathered from the forest floor may carry the residue of catastrophe. A berry plucked from a wild bush may hold within it the memory of fallout. Life thrives, but it thrives altered, its cycles infused with the unseen. For those who were displaced, the fields became memories rather than livelihoods. The harvest was no longer something to reap, but something to recall in stories told at kitchen tables far away. Grandparents described the feel of soil tilled in spring, the sound of scythes moving in unison at harvest, the taste of potatoes lifted from earth still warm with sun. To the young who have never seen those places, the villages are both distant and near, part of family history, yet forever out of reach. The forgotten villages hold more than silence. They hold a warning. Their emptiness is a monument to the fragility of what we build, to the thin line between abundance and abandonment. They show how quickly a community, rich with life and routine, can be erased not by fire or flood, but by something invisible drifting from the sky. They remind us that the permanence we assume in our homes, our fields, our towns, is less certain than we believe. And as the years pass, the forgetting itself becomes part of the story. Names of villages disappear from maps. Roads crumble, paths vanish beneath brush, and eventually, only foundations mark where walls once rose. The silence deepens, not only in the land but in memory. Yet somewhere, carried in photographs, in fading documents, in the recollections of those who still remember, the villages live on. They survive as ghosts woven into the landscape, unseen but present. The fields lie open under the same sky that once betrayed them. They breathe the same wind, drink the same rain. Life continues in its altered form, carrying forward the legacy of a disaster that reshaped not only the land, but the relationship between people and the earth itself. The villages may be forgotten in maps, but they are not lost in meaning. They stand as quiet reminders, scattered across the world, of what happens when the invisible reshapes the visible, when the ordinary becomes unreachable. And so the forgotten villages remain, silent yet eloquent, their empty fields stretching outward like unspoken words. They do not cry out or demand attention. They simply exist, lingering in stillness, holding within their soil the memory of what was, and the echo of what can never fully return. The earth shifted first, deep beneath the ocean floor, where tectonic plates pressed and strained against each other until the silence broke. The ground shook, rolling through cities and villages, toppling walls, cracking highways, sending waves of panic through the people who felt its strength. But the greatest force was yet to come, rising out at sea where walls of water gathered themselves and raced toward the shore. The tsunami struck with a weight beyond imagining. Towns along the northeastern coast of Japan were consumed in minutes, streets turned into rivers, homes splintered into fragments carried inland. Cars floated like toys, fishing boats were lifted and smashed against rooftops. Families fled to higher ground with only seconds to spare. The sea, once a source of life and livelihood, surged inward as an unstoppable wave, carrying with it everything in its path. Among the places it reached was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Built on the coast, its reactors stood as symbols of Japan's trust in the atom, a source of energy for millions. The walls that protected it from the sea had been designed to withstand waves, but not waves of such height, not waves driven by an earthquake of such magnitude. The water rose over barriers, flooded turbine halls, and drowned the backup generators meant to provide power in emergencies. In moments, the carefully balanced systems that controlled the reactors were undone. Inside the plant, workers moved quickly, navigating darkened corridors lit only by flashlights. Control panels flickered, alarms sounded, and the air grew heavy with heat. Without power, cooling systems failed, and the cores of the reactors began to heat far beyond their limits. Pressure built inside thick concrete vessels, steam rising, hydrogen accumulating in spaces never meant to hold it. Engineers spoke in calm voices, making decisions under conditions no manual could fully anticipate. Each choice was weighed against the knowledge of what failure might unleash. Then came the explosions. One after another, blasts tore through the outer buildings, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the sky. The images were carried instantly across the world. walls collapsing outward, grey clouds rolling over the coastline, the plant's silhouette fractured against the horizon. It was no longer a local disaster, but an event watched by millions, each image carrying with it a weight of fear, memory, and uncertainty. The sea had delivered not only destruction, but also a paradox. Water, meant to cool, had turned to steam and driven explosions. Water, meant to protect, had flooded the systems and stripped them of their strength. And in the days that followed, water became both saviour and threat. Firefighters and workers pumped seawater into the reactors in desperate attempts to keep them from melting down, knowing the salt would corrode and ruin them, but caring only for the moment. Helicopters dropped water from above, each pass a brief measure against forces still rising. Beyond the plant, the consequences unfolded quietly. Radiation seeped into the air, carried inland by shifting winds. Villages near the plant were evacuated, families leaving with only what they could carry, stepping away from homes they had known for generations. Farmers left fields planted but unharvested, animals wandered untended, and entire towns fell silent as buses carried people toward uncertain futures. The ocean itself became a vessel for the disaster. Water used to cool the reactors leaked back into the sea, carrying with it radioactive isotopes that spread into the currents. Fishermen, whose livelihoods had always depended on the waves, watched as their boats remained tied in harbour, nets unused. The sea that had always provided was now marked by suspicion, every catch tested, every tide carrying with it questions of safety. The dark water carried more than salt and silt. It carried memory, fear, and contamination. For those who remained nearby, the routines of life changed in small but profound ways. Meals were measured not only in portions but in doses. Rice harvested from certain regions was tested, vegetables inspected, fish scrutinised for what could not be seen. Children played indoors rather than under open skies, parents watching the weather forecasts not only for storms, but for wind directions that might bring unseen particles closer. Yet, in the midst of crisis, there were also acts of quiet courage. The workers who stayed at the plant, later called the Fukushima 50, though they numbered more, remained in place despite knowing the risks. They walked through corridors thick with heat, opened valves, connected hoses, and stood in the presence of radiation that others fled. Their efforts slowed what might have been worse, buying time in a battle that could never be fully won. The disaster stretched across days, then weeks, then months. Each report carried new measurements, new maps shaded to show contamination zones, new decisions about which families could return and which must remain away. Schools relocated, businesses closed, and entire communities scattered. The sense of dislocation was not temporary, but lasting, as people wondered whether the places they had once called home would ever be safe again. Unlike the sudden violence of the tsunami, the nuclear disaster unfolded with a quiet persistence. Its danger was not measured in waves or flames, but in isotopes that lingered, that entered soil and water, that spread into food chains. It was a crisis without sound, a disaster marked not by the roar of destruction, but by the stillness of absence. The dark water seeped into memory as deeply as it had seeped into the ocean, its effects unfolding slowly over years. And yet, life continued, as it always does. Fields near the zone grew wild in the absence of farmers, flowers pushing through cracks in roads, boar and deer wandering through abandoned streets. The resilience of nature stood in contrast to the fragility of human structures, a reminder that the world moves forward even when people cannot. The silence of empty towns echoed the forgotten villages of other disasters, but here the ocean pressed close, its waves endless against the shore, carrying the story outward. Fukushima became a name spoken not just in Japan, but across the globe, joining a list already heavy with others. It carried with it questions about safety, about trust, about how humanity balanced its need for energy against the risks of the atom. For some, it became a reason to abandon nuclear power, to close plants, to seek other paths. For others, it was a lesson in resilience, a chance to rebuild with greater caution. But for those who lived in its shadow, it was less a debate than a daily reality, woven into every choice, every meal, every memory of the day when the sea rose and the world shifted. The dark water of Fukushima does not rest. It moves in cycles, through currents, through systems of energy and memory alike. It carries with it not only isotopes, but the weight of all that was lost, all that was endured, and all that remains uncertain. And like the disasters before it, it lingers, not loudly, but quietly, woven into the silence of abandoned homes and the endless rhythm of the tide. The sea has always been a keeper of secrets. It swallows wreckage and carries it across continents, turns sharp edges smooth, and hides stories beneath layers of salt and silence. Long before nuclear power was born, ships sank with cargoes that vanished into currents, and coastlines learned to expect strange arrivals. Timbers from storms, bottles with fading notes, the driftwood that no hand remembered setting afloat. But in the age of the atom, what the water carried changed. It was no longer only fragments of wood or glass. Now the sea bore something quieter, invisible, and far harder to forget. After Fukushima, the waves rolled outward, carrying not only debris from shattered villages and boats tossed inland, but also something unseen. Radiation entered the water in streams, seeped through cracks and channels, and mingled with the tides. It spread as the ocean always does, slowly but endlessly, moving beyond the shoreline of Japan into the vast Pacific, where no boundary could contain it. On the western coast of North America, years later, small traces appeared. Scientists testing the water spoke in measured tones, their findings not of imminent danger, but of connection. A molecule once lodged in concrete near a reactor wall now rode the surf in California. An isotope born in a vessel of steel drifted into the harbours of Vancouver. The sea, impartial and constant, had carried secrets thousands of miles, scattering them like whispers. Not all that washed ashore was invisible. In the months after the tsunami, beaches across the Pacific received objects carried by the same tides. A child's ball appeared on a coast far from where it had once been tossed in play. A fishing boat, weathered but intact, reached Alaska after more than a year at sea, its hull still holding the scent of salt and fuel. Shoes, nets, fragments of houses, even entire docks drifted across, arriving quietly on foreign shores, reminders of lives disrupted on the other side of the world. Each object held a story, though most would never be traced back to a single name or family. The tides, relentless and patient, remind us that distance is not defense. What happens in one corner of the ocean does not remain there. Currents, like memory, are incapable of stillness. They move with the pull of moon and wind, wrapping the world in a cycle that cannot be broken by borders. And so the disasters born at power plants or carried by fallout found their way into places far beyond their origin, woven into the global sea. This truth was not new. Decades earlier, other waters had carried other legacies. In the days of testing, when mushroom clouds rose over Pacific atolls, fallout settled on the surface of the sea. The ash drifted down, mingling with plankton, slipping into the food chain. Islanders far from the test sites felt it in their water, tasted it in fish, measured it in health long after the explosions ended. The ocean had received what the sky delivered and carried it forward in silence. Along coasts across the world, fishermen and sailors learned to mistrust what once had been dependable. A catch of tuna in one season might be suspected, its flesh tested, its sail delayed. Seaweed gathered by hand could no longer be assumed safe without proof. Families who had lived from the water for generations began to weigh each meal against unseen risks. The ocean, once a source of stability, had been given a burden it never asked for, and still, the sea endured. Its surface sparkled beneath the sun, waves broke in rhythm against rocks, gulls wheeled overhead in search of food. To the eye, nothing seemed altered. Only in laboratories, in numbers on printed pages, did the truth appear. The waters had changed, carrying within them traces of accidents and explosions, marks of human ambition and error. There is a quiet strangeness in knowing that the same tide which laps at the shores of one village may later touch another on the far side of the world. A drop of water in the Pacific may circle for years, moving through currents, sinking, rising, crossing equators, slipping past islands and continents alike. Within that drop may rest a particle from a reactor wall, a memory of heat, a fragment of a story once thought contained. The ocean holds no anger. It does not choose what it carries. Yet in its vastness, it ensures that nothing vanishes completely. Debris will surface, radiation will disperse, stories will arrive where they are least expected. The tide is both eraser and messenger, smoothing edges while delivering reminders. For those who walk the beaches where such remnants appear, the effect is subtle but lasting. A ball, a shoe, a dock, or a trace of something unseen, all are reminders that the disasters of the atom are not bound by place or time. They ripple outward, as quiet as the sea on a calm day, yet as far-reaching as its horizon. Villages once evacuated, fields left untended, rivers closed to fishing, all become part of a larger map, drawn not only on land, but on water. The dark water near Fukushima, the fallout near Pacific Islands, the drifting ash carried by storms, all meet in the endless basin of the ocean. And when the tide rolls in, it carries with it not only shells and seaweed, but the faint marks of history itself. There is no single moment when such marks disappear. They fade slowly, dispersing into vastness, measured in half-lives and decades, in plankton blooms and migrations of fish. Generations may pass before they slip beneath notice. But the sea does not forget quickly, and each wave that touches the shore carries with it a trace, however small, of what has been placed within it. Standing at the water's edge, one can watch the tide and see only foam and light. Yet beneath that surface is the story of centuries, the accumulation of what has been given to the sea, willingly or otherwise. Ancient shipwrecks, storms, driftwood, and now isotopes and ash, all travel the same paths, all are bound by the same currents. And in this, the disasters of the nuclear age become part of the same endless cycle. The tide will always return, carrying with it what it has gathered. Some secrets may be too small to see, some too quiet to notice, but none are truly gone. The ocean remembers, and in its returning waves, it leaves traces on the shore for those who choose to look. And so, the story moves outward from coasts scarred by reactors and fields left empty, into the vastness of the sea that touches all lands. The tide, patient and unceasing, delivers its cargo without judgment, reminding each place it touches that history is never contained. It drifts, it settles, and it arrives, over and over, as quietly as the waves themselves. Memory is a current of its own. Like water or wind, it moves unseen, shaping how people live, even when the source has long since faded from view. Radiation is invisible, and so too is memory. Both leave marks that cannot always be measured by the eye. Together they linger, one in soil and bone, the other in thought and story. And as the years pass, disasters that began as sudden ruptures do not vanish. They sink into the quiet places of human recollection, glowing faintly, like embers buried beneath ash. For those who live near places where accidents unfolded, memory began not as history, but as sensation, the sharp order to evacuate, the distant thud of an explosion, the taste of iodine in water, the hurried packing of belongings left behind. Some memories were physical. The landscape seen through a bus window as it was abandoned, the hush that fell over a once bustling village, the empty chair at a family table. Others were intangible, carried in the air itself, the fear of what could not be seen, the uncertainty of whether absence would be temporary or permanent. Yet memory does not remain fixed. Over time, the edges blur. What was once vivid softens, becomes a story told more quietly, and eventually a story told to those who were not there at all. Children of evacuees grow up with tales of fields they never saw, kitchens that were left as they had been on a single day, communities dissolved not by choice, but by caution. The disasters of reactors and tests live on not only in scientific charts or government archives, but in family conversations, in the pauses between words, in the sigh before a sentence begins. Some memories are carried into art. Painters capture the stillness of abandoned buildings. Photographers wander through forgotten streets. And musicians compose pieces that echo both sorrow and endurance. Memory lingers in images of empty schools, in walls lined with peeling paint, in playgrounds where rust gathers but no children return. Each act of preservation becomes its own response to the glow of history, an attempt to keep what might otherwise be swallowed by silence. Governments and institutions too keep memory alive, though in a different way. Archives store records, measurements, minutes of meetings, and orders stamped with urgency. Maps remain marked with exclusion zones, long after the fences themselves have faded. Signs warn of radiation in forests, where trees grow thick once more. Even when landscapes appear healed, memory is not erased. It is fixed in law, in policy, in boundaries that declare a place unsafe, even if grass covers every scar. There is also memory that does not belong to any single person. Collective memory grows when stories spread, crossing borders, reaching those who never felt the disasters firsthand. Names like Chernobyl, Fukushima, or Kishtim become more than places. They become symbols. They carry weight beyond their geography, reminders of fragility in an age of power. A photograph of a deserted city square or a crumbling reactor wall is enough to stir recognition, even among those far removed from its history. Memory in this way becomes shared, stitched into the consciousness of humanity itself. And yet, not all memory glows in fear. There are memories of resilience, of people who carried on despite loss, of farmers who returned to cultivate fields at the edge of exclusion zones, of scientists who devoted their lives to understanding what went wrong, determined to make the future safer. Families rebuilt homes elsewhere, creating new routines, new places to anchor their days. Memory, while carrying grief, also carried adaptation. It reminded people not only of what was lost, but of the endurance that followed. Still, the glow persists. It flickers in stories whispered at night, in textbooks taught in schools, in monuments erected to honour the displaced and the fallen. It lingers in language itself, where certain words are forever tied to shadows of catastrophe. A place name, once only geographic, now evokes silence, evacuation, or contamination. A date etched in calendars continues to stir recollection long after the clocks have moved forward. In some ways, memory behaves like radiation itself. It decays slowly, measured not in hours but in decades. Its half-life is not easily known. One generation passes its memory to the next, who in turn may soften it but rarely erase it. Stories endure, handed down, reshaped, repeated, until they become almost elemental. Just as fallout settles into the soil, memory settles into culture. Even when buried, it remains, waiting to be uncovered. There is a peculiar stillness in places tied to such memory. Tourists walk the silent streets of Pripyat, guided through halls where clocks stopped long ago. They take photographs not simply to capture what is there, but to hold on to the weight of memory itself. The silence becomes part of the story, and those who visit carry it home, adding to the chain of recollection. In this way, memory does not remain bound to the places it began. It travels, just as the tides carried debris across the sea. The glow in human memory is not always heavy. It can also be a quiet guide, a reminder of caution, a call to restraint. Decisions about energy, about risk, about the balance between progress and safety, all are shaped by what lingers from the past. The disasters that once shocked the world continue to influence the choices of today. Their memory shaping policy, research, and the guarded optimism with which new technologies are received. But beyond governments and institutions, the glow remains in something more human. It is in the way a parent hesitates before serving food from a certain region, in the way a grandparent recalls the moment a siren broke the calm of a morning, in the way a photograph is held a little longer because the faces in it belong to a home that no longer exists. These are the quiet places where memory lives, unrecorded, yet powerful. As time stretches forward, some memories will dim, softened by distance, overshadowed by new stories. Yet others will remain, etched too deeply to fade. They will be passed on, as lullabies or warnings, as photographs or silences, ensuring that the disasters of the atom do not vanish into the obscurity of forgotten events. Instead, they will continue to glow faintly, like lights left burning in the corners of human thought, reminders of both power and vulnerability. And so, memory joins the sea and the land as another vessel that carries the story of nuclear disasters. It moves through generations, invisible yet persistent, shaping how people live, how they build, and how they remember. It is a glow that does not blind, but instead flickers steadily, refusing to be extinguished. The world moves on, but memory, like radiation, lingers. And in its lingering glow, humanity finds not only its past, but its reflection, a reminder of what was once unleashed, and of what must never be forgotten. There has always been reverence for fire. In ancient times, flames were kept alive in temples and hearths, treated as gifts of the divine, both feared and cherished. Fire was warmth in winter, light in darkness, but also destruction when it slipped beyond control. Humanity learned long ago to live beside it with a certain humility, never forgetting its double nature. Yet when the atom was split, a new kind of fire was born, one that did not flicker in wood or coal, but glowed from the heart of matter itself. It was fire without flame, heat without limit, light unseen but powerful enough to unmake cities. And for this fire, the old reverence returned, though it was expressed not in ritual or prayer, but in whispers. The disasters that unfolded across the decades did not silence this fire, but they changed the way people spoke of it. Once hailed in headlines as the key to a new age, atomic energy slowly became a subject cloaked in caution. Officials chose words carefully, scientists spoke with restraint, and communities, when discussing the plants near their homes, lowered their voices as though the very subject required gentleness. It was not merely the technical risk that inspired this hush, but the weight of memory, what had already been lost, and what could never be undone. When a reactor failed, or a test scattered fallout across the sky, the initial voices were often loud, sirens, broadcasts, statements filled with urgency. But after the alarms faded, what followed was not shouting, but quiet. Explanations came in subdued tones, details emerged slowly, and in the silence that filled the gaps, rumours found their place. People whispered of illnesses, of livestock lost, of water that no longer tasted the same. These whispers carried farther than official statements, sustained by the unease of what could not be seen. The whisper became a kind of survival. In villages near exclusion zones, conversations rarely spoke directly of radiation. Instead, they circled around it. Families said a certain field was no longer safe, without naming why. Children were told not to drink from certain streams, but the word itself, radiation, was avoided, as though uttering it too often would give it strength. Fear took the shape of silence, and silence became the language by which communities endured. Even in distant lands, where the disasters were only reports on the news, the same whispering tone emerged. Parents reassured children that they were safe, but the words carried a softness that betrayed doubt. Public debates about nuclear energy often unfolded with formality, as though passion itself was inappropriate in the presence of something so grave. The atom's fire did not invite shouting matches. It called forth restraint, as if loudness might awaken it again. The world adjusted in subtle ways. Maps included shaded areas where people could not return, yet those areas were often left unspoken in conversation, reduced to a quiet gesture or a pause. Farmers sold crops from safe fields, but neighbours remembered which farms had once been close to the line, and whispered before buying. Governments built storage sites for waste, entombing the remnants of reactors in concrete, but when speaking of them, used phrases that sounded more like lullabies than warnings. Containment, shielding, secure storage. It was language designed to soften what could not truly be softened. The fire itself did not fade. Reactors continued to hum, their cores glowing with invisible heat, powering cities, lighting homes, turning night into day. But the way humanity lived alongside them changed. Tours of new plants emphasized safety above all else. Brochures spoke less of limitless progress and more of careful stewardship. Engineers spoke in precise terms, as though each syllable carried weight. In these tones lay an acknowledgement. This fire was not like the others humanity had tamed. It demanded a different posture, a quieter presence. For those who had seen the disasters firsthand, the whisper was not only cultural, but personal. Survivors often hesitated to share their experiences, not out of shame, but because words seemed inadequate. How could one describe the sight of an invisible force scattering lives apart, or the quiet of a city emptied in a single night? Some memories resisted speech, living instead in silence, in gestures, in the long pause before a reply. The whisper was not only about fear, it was also about the limits of language itself. And so across decades and continents, the whisper grew into a global pattern. Whether in villages near test sites, cities evacuated after accidents, or nations debating the future of energy, the fire of the atom was rarely spoken of directly. It was surrounded instead by careful phrases, softened terms, lowered voices. Even those who believed deeply in its promise adopted this quiet, as though to speak of it loudly would be to tempt its darker side. Yet in this whisper lay a lesson. It was not denial, nor was it surrender. It was the recognition that some forces require humility. Just as ancient peoples kept eternal flames burning in guarded temples, humanity learned to keep the nuclear fire within walls of concrete and steel, tended by watchful eyes, surrounded by silence. The disasters had taught that arrogance was dangerous, and so caution became the language of survival. Children born decades after these events would hear the stories not in shouted warnings but in softened tones. A parent explaining why a city remained abandoned spoke quietly, as though raising the voice would disturb its ruins. A teacher describing fallout or half-lives used steady, even speech, careful not to spark fear while still conveying truth. The whisper shaped the way new generations inherited memory, giving them both awareness and restraint. Fire, after all, is not extinguished by silence, but silence changes how it is approached. The atom's fire, too, continued to burn, contained in reactors, present in weapons, humming in the background of the modern world, yet, around it, humanity had learned to step lightly, to use words that calmed rather than provoked, to move forward with the caution of one who knows the cost of overconfidence. This whispering world is not one of despair. It is a world that carries both memory and hope, both fear and endurance. By whispering, humanity acknowledged that the fire it had kindled was unlike any before it, capable of giving light, but also of casting shadows that stretched across generations. The whisper became a way of living with that truth, a quiet balance between reverence and caution. And so, as the centuries-old relationship with ordinary fire gave rise to rituals and traditions, so too did this new fire create its own culture of silence. In whispers around dinner tables, in careful words of officials, in the quiet tones of scientists explaining their work, the language of restraint became part of life. It was not only what the disasters had left behind in soil and water, but what they had left behind in human voices. A lingering hush, a lesson spoken softly. The glow in human memory had already been etched deeply, but here it found its expression in language itself. To whisper around fire was to admit both its power and its fragility, to hold it close but never too tightly, to acknowledge its presence without tempting its wrath. It was a way of living with something too large to forget, too powerful to ignore, and too dangerous to shout about. The fire still burns, humming in its guarded chambers, silent yet immense. Around it, the world continues to whisper, as though reminding itself with every soft syllable that caution, humility, and silence are sometimes the truest forms of wisdom. And so we end tonight's story in a hush, the same hush that has always followed when humanity has touched the edges of its own power. What we have wandered through are not just accidents or events on a timeline, but quiet reminders of how fragile the balance has always been. Entire towns emptied in a single night. Villages left behind, with only the ghosts of fields and the silence of abandoned wells. Families who carried invisible burdens for years. And through it all, the whisper, soft, cautious, and enduring. What we faced together in this journey was the weight of memory. The way fire without flame left behind shadows on the land, and whispers in human voices that have never fully faded. It is a history told less in noise and more in absence, less in what was said, and more in what could no longer be spoken aloud. As you drift toward rest tonight, hold on to the stillness of that truth. That some stories are not warnings shouted, but echoes that settle gently, teaching us that progress is not only about reaching forward, but about remembering what must never be repeated. If you found calm in this quiet retelling, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so these soft histories can continue to reach you night after night. And in the comments, share your thoughts. What moment in this story stayed with you the most? Which silence spoke loudest to you? Each reply is like another candle in the dark, another reminder that across the world, others are listening in the same hush as you are now. Thank you for letting this story accompany you into sleep. May your night be as gentle as the whispers we have followed.